This video is going to go over the expectations for a notebook lab report in quantitative analysis. So before we jump into that, I wanted to remind you of the rules and guidelines when you're using a carbon copy lab notebook in general. So if you have a carbon copy lab notebook that you use in a different lab course, you can use it for this class as long as there are enough blank pages. Okay, if you do not own a carbon copy lab notebook, you're going to have to get one before our first lab. On every page in the notebook, you need to have the title of the lab, the date you performed the experiment, and your name. Let's say one lab took 4 pages of your carbon copy lab notebook before you got all the information in there. Each of the 4 pages has to have all this information on it. It's not enough just to put your title, your name, and your date on the first page and just assume that it works for everything else. You have to have it on every single page so it's very clear when someone looks at your notebook what information, the information that's on a page, what lab it was, when you did it, and who was the scientist that performed it. You're that scientist. Your table of contents, which is in the front of every carbon copy lab notebook, you just need to update that as you perform experiments. So once you finish the first lab, go to your table of contents, write the title of the lab, write the page numbers in your carbon copy lab notebook that it was over, and then just keep updating that throughout the semester. When you write in your lab notebook, it must be in blue or black ink, and it cannot be in erasable ink. You don't want to ever have the temptation to erase something. When you write in lab notebooks, it's supposed to be a permanent copy. So if you make a mistake, since you can't erase it, you will cross it out using one line or possibly an X, especially if it's over a large amount of space. So that way it's still visible what you had written, but it's clear to us that it was a mistake because you crossed it out. We can't erase and you can't scribble through something because then it looks like you're hiding something. Be as neat as possible because people are reading your notebook. At the end of doing a lab and completing all the information that you need to, any large blank space, so empty space on any of the pages that's at least 1 inch by 1 inch, needs to be crossed out with a diagonal line and dated. I'll show you that here in a second. And then you can find in Canvas the procedure, the safety data sheets, and the list of the calculations that you have to perform and the conclusion statements, what you need to include in the conclusion statements portion of the notebook report. So let's go through the notebook lab report. What are the headings that need to be there, and then what information needs to be in each heading. Now on this slide, we're going through the part of the notebook lab report that you will have already completed when you turned in your pre-lab pages. So that's great. Part of your notebook lab report will be done before you even start the lab. So there'll be the title with your name and date on every page. Okay. The materials, which is just a list of the chemicals, glassware, and equipment you're using for that lab. The safety and waste, which will include your summary of the safety data sheets that you read on Canvas, as well as the waste handling procedures that you were given within the lab procedure, and then the procedure itself. So that's where you're either going to use your black or blue pen to rewrite the procedure into your lab notebook from the procedure that was given to you in Canvas, or print out the procedure that's given to you in Canvas, use scissors to cut out the procedure, and a glue stick to glue it to the page. So this is part of the pre-lab pages. This you will have turned in already. Okay. Now, after you've while you're collecting the data, and afterwards, this is the rest of the notebook lab report. You'll have your data section, which is where your data tables will be in a nice organized way, including the data values. I suggest having those data tables drawn or created before lab starts, so you're just filling in the numbers during the lab. If there's an unknown number, which is true, or it's just true often, or sometimes our unknowns aren't numbers, but they're things like you got Mountain Dew as your unknown. Make sure you record that in the data section. That's going to be very important information. Then there's the calculations section. Surprisingly, you're doing calculations here. So in the lab procedure, there are calculation sections in the lab. There's also information on Canvas with a list of the calculations you have to do. So when you're doing the calculations, you have to show the work for every type of calculation. There's some exceptions to this, but I'll explain that in a second. But let's say it's a titration lab and you have to do 4 trials. And the first calculation you have to do is to solve for the molarity of the sodium hydroxide in trial 1. So you're going to do your dimensional analysis. You'll use your molar mass and your mole ratio and your volumes, and you're going to solve for the molarity of trial 1. Well, trial 2, trial 3, trial 4, those are going to be the same calculation. You're just going to be changing the data values. So you don't have to show the work for trials 2, 3, and 4. You do have to show your final answer for those. So if you have to do multiple trials, show the work for the first trial and then do the work. You can just do it in your calculator, or you can show the work in your lab notebook. It's not going to hurt anything if you do. But you are required to show the calculation for every type of calculation you're doing once. The exceptions to that are you never have to show the work for doing the average calculation, for doing standard deviation calculations, or for doing relative standard deviation calculations. These are statistics that we're doing constantly. And I mean, I will be checking them that you did them correctly, but you don't have to show the work for that. Meaning you can use Excel or your calculator or something to help you with that where you don't have to show the work. But any sort of calculation that you're doing, that you're solving for grams or milliliters or molarity or percent or something, you have to show the work. The only exceptions are average, standard deviation, and relative standard deviation. For those, you can just write the word average equals number, standard deviation equals number, percent relative standard deviation or percent RSD equals number. The conclusion statement is, and it might be more than one statement, but it's a summarization of what was the point of the lab and what did you learn? So you're summarizing the important things that you learned from the lab. In Canvas, there's a list of the things that have to be included for each lab in the conclusion statement. In general, that's going to be saying things like unknown number 4 had an average percent KHP of 49.32%. The standardized sodium hydroxide had an average molarity of 0.1033 molarity with a standard deviation of this and a relative standard deviation of this. It's kind of taking all the calculations that you did and summarizing that to where if someone looked at the lab, they could read the conclusion statement and know what you learned. When you're writing these types of statements, it needs to be in third person, so no I, me, you, we, her, him, Beth. No, it's just statements and they're past tense because by the time you're writing the conclusion statement, you have already done it. So, unknown number 4 had a percent KHP of 33.9%. Not I thought or I found, none of that, and not future or current tense. It has to be past tense. If you have questions about that, absolutely let me know. Okay. So after you finish all those sections in the notebook report where each of those bolded things are sections, headings, okay, that's when you're going to cross off any empty space. So you wait until you get everything done. And then once you're finished with the whole lab, look for any empty gaps that are 1 inch by 1 inch. Draw a diagonal line and date it. So let's look at an example. This is the same example that I showed for the pre-lab pages, but I'm going to do the entire thing. So you can see the title of the lab, my name, and the date. Then I have my materials section where I listed the chemicals, the glassware, and the equipment, including concentration of the chemicals. My safety and waste, where I summarized how I'm going to handle the waste and what I learned about safety. Now, once I was done with the lab, there is this big space down here at the bottom that was empty. So I did a diagonal line and put the date on it. That's what we do at the very, very end. Okay, so I couldn't fit anything else on this page. So I went to the next page for the procedure. Now notice on the next page, I still have a title, my name, and the date. So I had procedure there, and then I had cut and glued the procedure into the lab notebook. Then I have my data section. So I have a list of what the numbers are. You can't just write random numbers down. You need to tell me what that number is. So where it says mass of empty crucible. So I know that number was the mass of the empty crucible. If you just wrote 24.2868 grams by itself, that is not good lab notebook procedure. You have to make sure everything is labeled and clearly able to read. Okay, so that's my data section. For this lab, there just wasn't a lot of data. It was a gravimetric analysis, so we made a solid, we filtered it, and had to weigh the solid. So that's pretty much why there's not as many data values as there are for, say, titrations. Okay, and then next, it's the calculations section. So I showed my calculation, which using, the molar mass, the mole ratio, and molar mass again. And I kind of circled or boxed in, I guess, my final answer for this. And then my conclusion statement. The reason why it used to say analysis is I used to call it that, but that's confusing once we look at our typed report terms. So the conclusion statement in a sentence using past tense, third person, I'm saying the unknown nickel solution contained that many grams of nickel 2 sulfate hexahydrate in 250 milliliters, which would have been the thing that I was told to write in the conclusion statement. And then at the bottom, there was some blank space. So after I finished my conclusion statement, I did a diagonal line across it with the date. Okay, so what I want to show you now are the where this information, the information that we need to find in Canvas. So here's our Canvas page. I'm going to click on the lab section. And I'm going to go to the first lab, Introduction to Balancing Glassware Solutions and Dilutions. And we've talked about how it tells us the date the lab is being performed on campus. There's the procedure that you would have read before the lab started and potentially printed out and cut out and glued into your lab notebook. There's the safety data sheets that you would have read and used to complete the safety part of the safety and waste component of the notebook report. The waste information comes from the procedure, the to-do list, and the lab videos that you would have read through and watched before you did your lab. There's the information about the pre-lab pages and where you would have turned in your pre-lab pages. And then it says in this one, in the notebook and typed report calculation section include. So this information is all in the procedure, but I wanted to make sure you had a checklist so you could look at it before you turn in anything to make sure you did everything. So here's me summarizing. Make sure in the calculation section of your notebook report that you've done all of these things. And then below that, it says in the notebook report conclusion statement section include these things. So that's, I'm telling you what you need to include in your conclusion statement. It also mentions the typed report here because this is one lab where you have to do the notebook report and the typed report. So this information is for both of those. And then down here at the bottom, you can submit your notebook report by clicking there, and I have the due date. There are graphs that you have to do for this lab. So those graphs will always be done on Microsoft Excel, and then you will upload those graphs here. Graphs, you do have to print and glue the graphs into your notebook, your lab notebook. They are a permanent record of what you needed to do. So you would have had to print this and glue it, but I'm also asking you to upload the graphs here. And the typed report we'll talk about in a different video. So this is how you know that you've completed everything you needed to. Okay. So hopefully this helps you understand what's expected of you for the notebook report, which you'll be completing lots of these throughout the semester.